So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ben Werner. I lead product marketing here at Privado.ai. I'm joined today by Nishant Bhajaria, and we're going to be going over privacy risk management, how to build a world-class privacy risk management program, building controls that scale with technology. So welcome everyone. Happy Thursday from wherever you are. We're excited to have you here to go through uh, some exciting content today. And just want to let everyone know that this session will be recorded. We'll send out the recording after the session. We'll send out the slides after the session. And we just want to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout today's webinar. We'll try to field the questions as they come in. If not, we'll answer them at the end. But yeah, we want to make this session as dynamic as possible. So yeah, please come with questions. So to kick it off, yes, yeah, I'm Ben Werner. I'll let Nishant introduce himself. Yeah, he's got a long resume of things he's done in the privacy space. So hand it over to Nishant.
Nishant Bhajaria. The J is pronounced as Nishant Bhajaria. I've
All right, yeah.
written privacy engineering, a few courses on LinkedIn Learning, but I've been in the field for cybersecurity and privacy for a while now. And what I'm working on these days is a way to help build products and platforms for engineers and attorneys and get them together. So today's event is going to help you do some of that. So happy to be here and can get kicked off here.
All right. Yeah, so today's agenda, we're going to go through some foundations of building a privacy risk management program, how to identify risks, how to implement controls, and opportunities to automate some of this activity.
So, and what we're looking at here is, go first. So if you look at the screen right now, we're talking about risk. If you look at what security and privacy have done for the last 15 years is they've focused on preventing bad stuff from happening. Like if there's a breach or an extraction of data or incorrect access, the goal is in how do you make sure that that doesn't happen. But it's very hard to map those things directly to a specific law. So compliance has a limitation in the sense that it's very hard to do something and get any sense of guarantee that you have met the compliance odds. I've seen companies invest a lot of money in compliance and then still fail because the compliance law was not very clear. So what we're doing in this event is how do you de-risk the business? If there's one thing companies hate, it's like uncertainty and risk. So how do you make sure that you can look at the gaps between where you are, where you need to be, define the risk, quantify the risk, categorize the risk, and then prioritize for fixing. So if you think of the 4 steps, you identify it, define it, you size it, and then you decrease it. So that's what this event's about. So if you look at the presentation today, we're going to be focusing on risk as a nice placeholder in place of actual compliance. Back to you, Ben. So if you look at privacy risk, primarily the goal has been how do you combine regulation and trust? If you look at the left-hand side, we're talking about promises we make to our customers, policies. People do read them sometimes, and it's the people who read them that will be a pain in your backside. Consent. Did you collect their data with consent? And have you made a contractual obligation? So that's not a legal law requirement per se. It could be, but from the most part, when you look at the left-hand side of the graph, we're talking about trust. On the right-hand side, we have specific regulations like GDPR, CCPA, others. If you implement all the laws in the country at the same time, which is pretty hard to do in the world, in fact, it's going to be very hard to map those to trust, and it's very hard to build things for trust and map them to regulations. So what we're saying is, if you have a combined offering in terms of risk, you can optimize for trust and regulation both at the same time. And I see a comment on the chat window. Let me see if there's a question. Yeah, that's a note taker. You can keep going. Okay, so before I jump into the slide, the key takeaway for folks on the call is when you go back to your jobs after this presentation, if you want to make sure that the folks in your company, whether it's the board of directors, the C-suite, your engineering lead, your PMs, etc., if you need to engage them when it comes to privacy and security, how do you get them to pay attention? So when you look at personal data, it could mean many different things. It's who you are and where you are and how you got to be where you are. So on the left-hand side, it's like who the offline and online identifier. So if you think about your SSN, your IP address in a small town, your first name, last name, if it's a rare one like mine, that's PI on the left-hand side. But that's not the only thing. When you look at sensitive data like health, location, your finances, biometrics, name of your kids, etc. And what we're basically saying is just as compliance and efficiency are not like mutually exclusive, but they're not easy to map with each other. If you look at the data on the left hand side and you look at the data on the right hand side, getting the data together is what defines risk. Like if you are in Nishant New York, it's still privacy sensitive because there are not very many people like me. In fact, when I became a US citizen 13 years ago, the FBI said to me that I'm the only person with my first name and last name combination in the world. So if you put me in New York, you put me in Dubuque, Iowa, it's going to be just as privacy sensitive. If you're Ben Warner and you put him in New York, it's going to be very hard to identify. It's like it's not a high risk name. Put Ben Warner in like Scappoose, Oregon, there's a good chance you can identify him. So personal data is a pretty contextual conversation here. Okay. I guess it's slow down a little bit. So let me repeat and slow it down a little bit. I thank you for the feedback, Brian. So when you look at personal data, the goal is how do you define personal data in the context of the problem at hand? So if you look at the first name and the last name, that may be identifying depending on where the user is. So if Ben is in New York, he's almost safe because there is no way to identify a specific Ben Warner in New York City. But if you put Ben Warner in a very small town, it's much easier to identify him. So what this slide is basically saying is that personal data is very, very context sensitive. So it's not just the first name, last name, or the location. When you want to add a few words to that?
Sure. Thanks, Nishant, for providing those examples. Yeah, I think starting out with any privacy risk program and just how you evaluate privacy risk out of companies is figuring out what is a priority, what is not a priority, how do we develop policies around personal data and privacy, and starting at this high level seems pretty basic, but it can get fairly complicated in determining what is personal data and what context it gets connected with personal data that can make it sensitive and potentially very high risk.
And I think what Ben makes is an excellent point here. And to go back to the main definition, if you look at first name, last name, and location, if it's a very small town, you may have no alternative but to delete the data. If Ben comes and says, "You've collected my data, it's very sensitive," you may have no choice but to delete his data. But at the same time, if you look at Ben in New York City or Ben in DC, you may not be able to delete his data, but you may just be able to obfuscate his data. As an example, you could look at Ben Warner and zoom out on the GPS a bit more, or modify the IP address a bit more. So when you do those things, you may be able to get away with not deleting the data. So what happens sometimes in privacy and security is a lot of engineers become one-track minded, like, oh, we got to delete this data, or we can't do anything. But what this slide is basically saying is when you look at the data that's coming in, you can make decisions on a case-by-case basis rather than all or nothing. That's the key takeaway. Hence the focus on risk rather than just compliance. You want to take this slide first, Ben?
Sure. So going back to how to start building a privacy risk management program, is just first looking at what data should be looked at, how we categorize, how we define it, and then looking at the types of risks that really matter to the organization. Where are we exposed from a collection standpoint? Are we getting consent? Are we, publishing consent correctly? Are we collecting it? Is it consistent throughout our organization? Are we acting on our privacy policies? Uh, where is the data going once it's collected? Are we sharing it accordingly? Do we know where it's being shared? How is it being used? Are we following the latest regulations as far as AI, automated decision making, and then storage? Where is it being stored? How far is it? How long is it being retained for? Is it going across borders? Who has access to it? So looking at these types of risks, seeing what is a possibility or a focus for your company, and then prioritizing them accordingly based on the potential impact as well as the likelihood at your organization.
And if you look at the four slides that Ben has put together, the four boxes, we're talking about risk in terms of sharing, collection, usage, and storage. You could collect data and not use it, and that could become a risk on its own because you now have the data that's in your systems. It is not being used. And what that means is anything happening to the data, any changes being happening to the data could backfire in the long run. You could collect data and use it, but not share it, and that might mitigate the risk. You might collect my data as an example, personalize my recommendation on Netflix as an example in this case, but then use that data for security purposes, and that expanded use case does not create more risk because it's security. So the goal of this slide again is to demonstrate that you can use data in multiple ways, but the risk definition and the risk impact can always change. So what we're pushing at Privado is how do you define risk in the context at hand? How do you then quantify the risk? How do you then mitigate that risk? So There is not going to be a one size fits all answer. And this is primarily why a law like GDPR or CPRA has not been terribly effective in winning customer trust. Like a lot of companies have done better with privacy because of those laws. But as you think about it, you cannot just say we're going to do XYZ because GDPR says so. A lot of engineers and a lot of privacy attorneys over the years have basically said this needs to happen because GDPR. You are much better off saying let's do all of these things on a contextual basis. Let's make on a case by case basis decisions, and then make the case that this is better for the consumer trust angle, and that will do a lot of good for GDPR compliance as well. If you win, I'll let you go first, man.
Sure. So, as I was mentioning on the previous two slides, I think a lot of the difficulty that organizations have, privacy teams have, is how to prioritize these risks because there's a lot of unknown risk out there. There's a lot of vary interpretation of, you know, what is high risk, what is low risk, what are the potential impacts. So I think a lot of times it's about really focusing on what is most important and what is most pragmatic for the organization. So I organized this, from looking at, what actions do you want to take, how do you evaluate the risk, how are you measuring the risk, and then how you align with stakeholders. So I think, there's going to be I think focusing first on, what are the biggest risks that should be blockers? Like, what are the absolute things that the organization needs to make sure they do not do in order to prevent any type of violation or any type of reputational damage? What are the biggest things that should be focused on? And then, prioritizing from there, what are the other things that need to be that should trigger reviews that can be remediated quickly, immediately, and then what things should be left up to the business. And once you kind of have that prioritization, you can look at, um, you know, part of that is actually looking at, how do you evaluate each risk, like I was saying before, around the likelihood, the impact on uh, future risk, whatever benefits you want to consider as you're collecting data. Um, but overall, I think that depending on the type of risk, it's a difficult trade-off to say, okay, we're going to use this certain type of data, but we could be breaking some type of law, right? So I think there's a range there, and it's for each company to evaluate. But it's important to have the conversation and then to look at, how are we going to measure success? What are the KPIs? And then getting everyone on the same page. So a lot easier said than done on this slide. I think that you could do a whole presentation on each one of these and the difficulties of pinning down what is the absolute best way to do it. But yeah, I think this is a good uh, list of things to consider as you're developing your privacy risk management program.
Yeah. Great call out, Ben. So I'll just mention an example from my Nike days. Like this is 11 years ago. And I had this privacy bug that was on the dashboard and nobody fixed it for like 10 days. And my concern was this is basically the wrong privacy policy. So when you sign into a website, you click on the submit button, it says by clicking submit, you accept our terms of use, right? So in one of those cases, we had the wrong privacy policy. We had folks in Germany getting the Dutch privacy policy. And I was pretty alarmed because the Dutch DPA is pretty powerful and was pretty powerful back then as well. And the first pushback I got from the PM team is prove to me that this risk is bigger than the 50 other risks we're dealing with right now. So it's bad for the company if somebody clicks on the policy link and gets the wrong policy. But my PM counterpart said that, hey, if somebody clicks on the submit button and the auth doesn't happen on time, that's a much bigger risk because then you can't sign in and you can't buy stuff. So if you look at this slide, we are talking about review processes, we're talking about cost of the violation, the likelihood that it gets enforced, the KPI. The reason we're pushing for that, Ben and I, in this presentation is that we want you guys to be able to quantify this. So when you go back to the C-suite, they'll have to prioritize. Like it's very easy for a CEO to come and say, we care about privacy, we care about human rights, we care about this, we care about that. Like it's easy to be for everything in the abstract, but when you have to make a judgment call as to what makes the cut and what doesn't, the numbers usually win. So we are pushing on KPIs exactly for that reason, because we want you guys to have that numerical context before you go and get stuff prioritized. Back to you, Ben.
Now, we had a question here. I think we could answer related to this slide around should organizations create a library of risks as a starting point for each privacy theme, such as storing or sharing, and then what methodology can be used to define the risk and uh, what to do about it.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. I think the key is like how good is going to be that how good is that initial list going to be? And it's probably not going to be very good because you are just starting out from scratch. But that's no reason to not do it. My recommendation would be to have an initial risk matrix and apply it to a low priority angle of the business. That'll give you a sense of how good the risk definition is. Do you have controls to identify the risk? Have you had controls to mitigate this? And you can essentially chart and see what that risk management process looks like. And then when you have the attorneys and the engineers and the PMs who are getting together and saying, okay, we overshot the runway on this risk, but we didn't do enough for this other risk. And you have that iterative process. So I agree with the premise of the question that you should have a library of risks as a starting point, but the goal is to have a bit of a loop there. So I call it a library, a loop of risks, because you want to quantify the risk and you mitigate the risk. And then you want to see what that risk happens when you have a different a business venture or a different team or a different data field. So have that list, but make sure that the list iterates on an ongoing basis. The goal is to have that initial list, apply it to the business, and then apply the learnings from that list to make that list better and automate the remediation process. What you want to do is reduce the risk, but also automate the fix of that risk as well. Back to you, Ben.
Thank you. I think we can move on to the next slide, next section on identifying risk.
You want to take this one or should I jump in? I'll let you.
Oh, sure. Okay. So, I think this is, I would say the primary source of risk in a lot of companies. You can start with, how is the user, uh, you know, using the products, using websites, using user-facing products, and how is their data flowing from that point of collection through the business, through their different user-facing products, back-end products, as well as all the partners, tools, and third parties they use. And a lot of the practices today, tools today look at data towards the right side of this graph of what data has been in storage, what data is in databases. But that's really looking at the data problem at the end of the process. If you look at how data is processed and collected from the start, you can see how it can spread very quickly throughout the organization, starting from a website, an app, or user-facing product, and then from there it can spread, to how it's being used, how it's being shared, and so this looks at just a good starting point to see, all right, where should we be focusing on our risk monitoring, risk mitigation, our practices, our processes, our technologies to help automate and identify risk discovery and then also risk remediation.
And the key point on this slide for all of you folks is when you look at risk from a privacy perspective, it's a combination of things all working together. It's like an orchestra. So you look at something that is customer facing on the left-hand side, that maps to a lot of back-end decision making. So when you collect somebody's consent to use the data for XYZ purpose, you have to hammer that consent onto the data and the use cases that store the data. So essentially the storage systems, the APIs that use the data. And then you identify what happens when X API uses Y data. So essentially that's the third box from the top. And then you identify what happens when the data gets stored or used. So the data has risk in and of itself. Storage locations have risk by themselves. Use cases have risks as well. And the backend infrastructure has risk as well. So the privacy risk in this case is not just endemic to the data itself. It's about the data and where it lives and who uses it. So don't think of risk from the lens of just the data. Because what happens in a lot of companies is people think that if they have too much risk and they delete their data, or they feel that they have way too much risk, it's gone anyways. So what you want to do is like quantify this risk by looking at different combinations of the data and make those judgment calls, because that will help you get the use cases better. We look at the question we answered a couple of minutes ago, which is having that initial list of privacy risks. The list will get bigger or smaller as you get yourself a lot more centered around this diagram. Back to you, Vin.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, I think with most companies today, every company has really become a tech company. Every company has become a software company, and even if uh, you're just using a lot of third-party tools, you still have your own website, you still have your own apps most likely, and oftentimes there's a lot of development happening internally to build whatever products and services are needed to deliver the services you need for your customers or the product that you're selling that may process personal data. So, yeah, I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot at Privado is really focusing on identifying risk early in the process, and that's most often not looking at the software and the products that are processing personal data from inception, from when the users start using the products and attacking that, addressing it before it spreads throughout the company and to other third parties.
And I think something else that I just thought about, and Ben made a great point there, was just a lot of people think about sharing risks when the data leaves the company. So when you send it to an ad partner or to a DPA or to a data broker, for a lot of folks, that's when the risk begins. And what we're saying here is the risk starts the moment you collect the data, because you become responsible for what happens to the data from that point forward. So don't wait until data gets egressed from the company, either willingly or unwillingly, because by that point, a bunch of decisions have been made. Because what you want to do is avoid making too many copies of the data. What you want to do is avoid too many folks having keys to the data. So that's the risk mitigation approach you need at the get-go, and not wait for sharing to happen. I think some folks have overlearned the lesson of the Facebook Cambridge issue in 2018, and they think the bad stuff happens when the data leaves the company. In reality, you are set up for bad stuff to happen the moment data enters your company. Back to you, Ben.
Sure. I think we can break down, the triggers or the causes for risks in these three categories. Nishant, you want to take these?
Sure. So when you look at risk within your organization, there's a good chance that what you're doing wrong is something that you've been doing wrong for a while. By the way, we have a question here. I think Julie Gorham has a hand up. Julie, you want to say something? I just noticed that she has a hand up for a while.
I did see that. Does she, can we give her speaking access? How does that work?
Um, Let me check.
But if you could just put your question in the chat or the Q&A, that'd be easier, I think. We
Julie, if you're on the call still, please type your question in the webinar chat. We're happy to answer it. I think we lost Julie once again. Nope, she's here. Okay, Julie, if you're there, maybe just
Oh, it was an accident. Okay.
okay.
We can continue.
Okay. So usually when risks happen in the business, it's basically because something that you've done today is stuff that you've been doing for a while. And it's just now become a risk because you're a bigger company, or people know how you exist, or customers have become smarter about something that you shouldn't have done from the get-go. So just because you've done something for a while, it doesn't automatically make it better. And oftentimes stuff that you've done like for the last 2 years becomes high risk because of a change to your business. So for a lot of companies, risk happens when they are totally unprepared because they have been doing this for a while. They think they have a downfall. It's like, my neighbor when he comes over and says, I grew up with dogs, I'm totally fine. And then he gets too close to my dog too soon and he gets bit. So I probably shouldn't compare like a privacy risk to like getting bit by a dog. It's kind of the same logic, which is you want to make sure that you look at your existing comfort zone and size up for the risk as well. And then, of course, there is something new, which is you have a new product or a new third party or a new use case or a new policy change that happens in some DPA someplace. So either a combination of what you've done for a while or something that is being changed because of some external event could cause risk. But the third part is especially concerning, which is the things you've been doing for a while become risks because the law changes. And my example that I love citing in this case is when Target was PCI compliant in 2014, it didn't stop them from getting breached. So there are examples when the business is not changing at all in response to regulations. So that's kind of the risk factor as well. So what have you done for a while that has become high risk? What is something new that you have done now that you haven't been done before and you don't know what the risks are? And then what has changed from a law perspective? So you need to look at all three angles for all your data, for all use cases, all storage locations. So if you look at Privado in that sense, we talk about automation and scanning for that reason, because we want to catch risk when it happens, because the data may not change, but something else may lead to a high risk scenario. When you want to add something there?
Yeah, thanks, Nishant. So I think it was trying to bring together the things we talked about already of, how do we define personal data? What are the types of risks? And I mean, this slide also brings in the element of regulatory change, which we know is uh, pretty constantly in flux and especially more complicated in the US. But I think to get ahead of those changes and risks that might be increasing, the if you have an understanding of what's already happening, right? If you have that underlying data map of all the data that's being collected, used, shared, and stored, then you can understand your risk profile and get ahead of any of these regulatory changes or increases in risk. Easier said than done, but the overall arching thing with these with privacy regulations in general, it is centered around these core tenets of privacy and data management. And so having that lay of the land of the data mapping can give you that foundational visibility as well as privacy risk monitoring capabilities. And then there's something new that's happening, right? There's constant updates to websites, products, apps, third parties, internal data use. They're just continuing to, um, accelerate in how data processing evolves. And so, how do you build in controls and checks to trigger these high priority risks so that some can be automated, some can be addressed automatically, some can be sent to the privacy team, and how are you monitoring regulation, as I was mentioning before. But if you have the first two things, covered for the most part, then you should be prepared for uh, most, if any, of the regulatory activity.
Yeah. And I want to pick up Vasala's question on the Q&A because I think it lines up with what we're talking about here. So from a consent perspective, so there is no easy consent KPI, Vasala. What I will say is that consent gives you the ability to tell stories. So as an example, if you have consent to collect somebody's data for security purposes, as an example, in the Meta use case, where you collect somebody's phone number to unlock their account. So you can use a phone number from the Facebook account for a person and use that phone number to unlock their Instagram account. That's a pretty defensible use case. What happens from that point forward is if you now conjoin the WhatsApp account and the Facebook, the Instagram account and the Facebook account, you have the potential of creating the social graph right there. So in that case, what happens is you now combine the data from somebody's Facebook account to their Instagram account. And now you have a richer identity about them. You can use that to sell them better services or target them more. The problem is the initial consent was only to unlock the account from a login perspective for security. So this is an example where you have used the data not in a bad way. You haven't done anything unethical per se, but you have essentially used the data for a much larger purpose than the consent was there for. So I would say when you make the argument for consent with the C-suite or your PM team or your eng team, present the 2 or 3 really egregious use cases that things will go wrong if you don't have consent. That's like my strong recommendation. But beyond that, what I would say is give them an example of what happens when you misunderstand consent. As an example, you collect a ton of data and then you use the data incorrectly, and then it turns out you didn't have consent. You now have to delete the data that was built with the data that you collected. You have to delete the APIs that were resting upon the data. So the amount of work that you have done that you have to throw away is pretty high. So that's the KPI. How much work can you get done with data without the consent? How much work you have to throw away because the consent didn't exist? And how much data will have to be deleted? Or more importantly, how much data got destroyed incorrectly because of lack of consent? So when you can tell people that story and then put a cost next to it, that'll be a lot better rather than trying to have a KPI that is generic. Because I think every company has a different consent use case. The consent use case for Nike is very different because we use consent at Nike to market stuff to you. But when I was at Uber or Google as an example, the consent is a much bigger import because the data is very, very molecular and the identification is much higher. So you want to have consent KPIs that make sense for your company, but start with the stories, start with the examples. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Nishant. Let's move along here, talking about different controls. So we're just going to go through some example scenarios that we talked about in the previous slide, just a little bit more detail of what kind of controls companies can build that scale with technology.
Yeah. So I would say when you look at controls, and people often wonder what qualifies as a control, I would say anything that identifies the risk, anything that gives you a proper measurable dimension for the risk, and then helps you mitigate that risk as a control. So if you have a data sniffer that identifies IP addresses collected pre-consent, that's a control because the control tells you that these IP addresses were collected before somebody logged in, which means we don't have consent, so we can use this IP address to secure their account, but we may not be able to use the IP address to give them ads, as an example. So anything that closes the gap between what is allowed with the data and what you do with the data is a control. So I would say the review process that happens in the beginning of the process of the development cycle, that's a control. The code scanning that Privado does, that's control. The PIA process is a control, and random reviews like an audit is also a control. So I'd say having those controls occur throughout the system is much better. rather than waiting for one control to do it for you. What you want to do is have multiple small controls, which will help you get better visibility across the board and help you improvise again and again with efficiency. That is a much better deal than having one control carry all the load for you. Back to
Yeah,
you.
I agreed. And so in this slide, we're just talking about some of the basic steps for any kind of software or product development lifecycle, from planning all the way to testing, releasing, and maintaining. And so this might refer to an entirely new product, a new feature, or just a minor update to a website or an app, or any kind of back end data pipeline, for example. So there's going to be different types of releases. But what we're trying to show here is that, if you're doing the right privacy reviews, even up front before anything gets built, there's still a lot of room for risk, and there still needs to be a lot of checks in order to get the right visibility. Because even in the planning phase, the what ends up happening between that and development and release, the software might change, right? There's still going to be updates going forward, and so what we're talking about here is putting in automation like code scanning, where you can validate that the software being built matches what the privacy review said in the planning phase. Okay, once it's being released, are we still running scans on the code to see if there's anything to do with the updates? Are those collecting any data or sharing any data or breaking any of our privacy policies? Uh, how can we update some of our reviews using code scanning and what we're also calling live product scanning? So live product scanning is really critical for actually testing consent and seeing what happens when users use products, if they're opting out, opting in, what data is collected, what data is shared as they're moving through any type of activity. You can run a simulation, record the data, and then identify any risks and ensure that the privacy policies are being followed.
Absolutely. And that's the whole takeaway here, which is you want to make sure that the policies are followed, but you can't do that for the policy as a whole in one go. So having those controls check for multiple things is a better approach than depending upon one policy, one review, or one control. Agree, Ben?
Thank you. Sure.
Okay.
So there's another process you could have for reviewing a third party, right? You have your standard vendor assessment, your contract review. Um, but what's difficult about any third party is that what might be in the contract might not actually reflect reality, right? The third party software is constantly changing. And then also, it's important to document what's in the contract and to understand, what are our obligations, what data can we collect, what data can we not collect. And so using live product scanning and code scanning technologies can help ensure that you're, only collecting and using data in your third party, as well as only collecting using data as they should.
And if you look at the scan option, I think what people are basically saying is let's scan the contract, scan the live product, and then scan the code. The order is not strict here. You may want to scan the code early on in the process, especially if you're writing a lot of new code at the outset. But if you have a legacy system, it may make sense to scan the live product because that's where the risks are most potent. So make these judgment calls on a case by case basis. Like too many people look at the plethora of PETs available and they want to throw everything at the wall. And what happens in that case is you sometimes use the wrong solution for the wrong problem. You want to identify the control in the context of a business and then decide what to scan first, the code or the product. Active.
Thank you. And so I would say one thing for the contract is that, yeah, there's still a standard contract review process, but there's now new contract scanning tools that can help document your obligations. And then you can leverage those to then build checks and say, okay, this contract says we're only collecting this data. And then, for example, you might uh, run a scan on your website and scan on your app, scan on your backend system and say, okay, we're actually sharing data that's not in the contract, and then you can raise an issue and make a remediation. Going back to the product development, there was a question earlier that I wanted to bring up is, Nishant, what do you think privacy protections, are they being built into core data systems as they're being built, or how much is added after the fact?
Adding privacy controls to people's systems is like being on a treadmill while eating a donut. So a lot of companies are getting much better at getting these controls built in early on in the process because it's expensive to build them down the road. Like once you have a certain amount of data or once you have a certain kind of use cases, it becomes very hard to mitigate those if you just have controls being built on the fly. So what a lot of companies are doing is buying those controls or building them at the early stage. Right? At Netflix is an example. We built a regex tool which looks pretty basic now. Back then it was a pretty big deal. We said, okay, we're going to check for IP addresses in JavaScript blobs, which meant that we could detect IP addresses coming in much earlier in the process. And then we could check and see if the workflow for those IP addresses had consent. If it didn't, we would sequester the data. So we built that pretty early in the process. But what happened is a lot of folks started becoming very careless with IP addresses because they felt we have this control that's fixing it. And what happened in that case is we built that protection into the core data set that we're collecting at the outset, but it created a sense of complacency. So what's happening is companies are doing much, much better at building these controls into their system at a very early stage. But people down the stream don't fully appreciate how much the risk has been contained and how much it remains. And as a result, the net has not been much improvement. So you have more investment in privacy, you have fewer incidents, fewer fines, but the misuse is still happening. So Richard, it's a great question. I would say the answer is yes, no, and maybe. It just depends on the company. Back to
Thank
you,
you.
Ben.
Sure. We just have one more example here, and I think this reflects more of an internal request, but how are we using the data internally? You can build in some sort of trigger, say, okay, this type of data request requires this type of privacy review, and then ongoing you can scan your systems, ensure that the the data that's being used internally, whether it's being sent from certain databases or collected from certain applications, it's following what the privacy policies were from the outset. Anything to add on this one?
I would basically say Ben said it all. I'll just add a little bit of a nuance here, but I think the maintenance part is very important. Like people sometimes think that automation is like one size fits all. I would not junk the review process that happened before something releases for the attorneys, because you want the attorneys to understand what the before and the after was. You want them to understand how stuff was fixed, or you want them to understand what happens if stuff doesn't get fixed. What I don't want to do is have people think automation and controls means the DPI doesn't matter. It matters. You just become more selective with it and you become more targeted with it. So I would say bring in the new, but don't lose the old.
Thank you. All right. Well, wrapping up with automation. So I think what we talked about before is getting and attacking risk from the very outset. So yeah, I'll pass this back to you, Nishant.
Yeah, I would say this slide goes very well with the question that's waiting from Srini Venkat about how do you compare a risk from a privacy perspective to a business risk of not making enough money. And I think I began this presentation with that analogy where I had a risk that was pretty high, in my opinion. And the business PM said that the risk I'm looking at is much bigger because if I don't sell this merchandise, you and I won't have a job. So how do you choose between lives and livelihood in the COVID days? How do you choose between privacy and business viability? I would say quantify it. If somebody's taking a bit of a risk with data that is contained to a certain geography or can easily be rolled back, that may be a risk worth taking, and there you might have to take a backseat for privacy. But there may be examples where somebody's taken on a risk for like an extra 10 million bucks, but the impact of the business, if the risk were to happen from a privacy perspective, could be like 30 million. That's your answer right there. So I would say identify the maximal potential benefit of the business risk somebody's taking, and then ask yourself what happens if the risk backfires from a privacy perspective, either for an individual in terms of their life or their livelihood, or from the business perspective in terms of a fine or a legal action. So tell yourself what is the best case, worst case, and then make the argument based on the money. I've kept saying this again and again throughout this podcast. Make the argument based on data, money, and trust. If you can make the argument on that, you can make better decisions every single time. Back to you,
Yeah,
Ben.
great points. And we got a question along the lines here of how do you quantify various privacy risks? How do you make a business case around it? How do you prioritize taking action and getting alignment internally to do so? And like a lot of things that Nishant have been saying, it obviously depends on your situation, but if there's a lot of storage risk, you're collecting a lot of sensitive data, for example, showing that if you don't attack and address the collection of data up front from where it's starting and whatever user-facing products or wherever the data is coming in, the amount of data and the difficulty of addressing the storage problem will become potentially insurmountable at a certain point, right? It will just be more costly down the road. Similar with data sharing, the quicker you can address it, once you're sharing with lots of different partners and you're not tracking it, it can become hard to even determine where the data is starting and where it's going and what data is going where and whether consent is being honored. I think in terms of getting into the specifics of the type of risks, most recently, there's been a lot of focus in the U.S. Regarding consent on websites, and there was just a recent, um, fine delivered by the California Privacy Protection Agency, or the Attorney General, with Healthline. They were not honoring consent. Also this week, the Roku, no, Fubo was also settled for not honoring consent in their platforms. So, I think some of those types of legal actions can be used or can show that the potential risk and building a case for that.
And I think consent is something that's very natural. Like people don't understand consent in an abstract way, but people understand consent through the lens of I said yes to this, but I never said yes to that. So when you look at the size of the growth of data, ask yourself, do you have permission to grow your data? Active?
Hmm.
I think almost a time at this point.
Sure. So I think as many people in the privacy space know, there's a lot of difficulty monitoring, capturing, acting on privacy risk because a lot of the activities and tools are fairly manual. There's a lot of questionnaires, interviews, surveys, and yeah, I think they've proven to not scale with technology. They result in, whether it's delays in a launch or a partnership or a marketing campaign, or there's something there's work that's trying to be done after the fact to address it, and it becomes even harder. And so things become outdated. There's lack of visibility, and there's constant change in the data flows as companies are, developing new software, updating websites and apps and third parties. So there's a lot of potential risk out there, and the I think what we've seen is the manual controls, yeah, have not been able to scale. Anything to add?
Yeah. The reason we talk about scale is that people forget that you have to at some point reduce risk on an ongoing basis. You can't obsess over one or two issues. So you will have to outsource it to automation at some point. The goal is how do you measure better? How do you fix faster? So scaling is not just about doing more with less, it's about doing more with but and doing it right. Back to you, Ben.
Definitely. So looking at a lot of the common needs we see, it starts with monitoring. How can we just get a lay of the land of, what personal data we have, what are the risks, how do we create triggers and identify these risks so we can take action on the most high priority ones, right? If you look at every single potential risk, you won't be able to really take effective action. So it's key to have something that can, based on your policies, your prioritization, uh, just highlight what should we target now? What do we have the business case for that we need to make the most immediate action on? And then what are some of the things that we can automate from a remediation standpoint? How can we block things from the outset? How can we enable just quick fixes here and there before risk can get out of control? And then how do you assess things, and show the value and performance and impact of a privacy program? And so having tools to help in each one of these stages, we found are huge needs for privacy programs.
Yeah, I got nothing to add, Ben. I think you took it all there.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, as we start to wrap up, yeah, we wanted to highlight the kind of the different types of technologies out there. So at Privado, there's obviously you can start off with any kind of manual assessments that are fairly common and a good starting point. But we found that the most high priority risk for most companies that we work with is on their website. Are they capturing consent correctly? Are they sharing any data with third parties they shouldn't be sharing, or they're not honoring consent? And so having that live product scan of their website, it seems to be the most high priority things for companies to address. Mobile apps are now becoming, more enforced, in terms of honoring consent and data sharing. So we have a mobile app scanning, app auditing product that can help identify these risks, see what data is being collected and shared. But to get the full scope of what data is being collected and processed, for companies that have a lot of internally developed software and software products and user-facing products, code scanning has been be able to provide the most automation and get the best scope in terms of all the data you're collecting and building that data map without manual processes that are not scalable. And then the other thing that can really help and is fairly easy to add to the checks and the visibility is scanning contracts to see, okay, how can we centralize and store what are our obligations with third parties, and then how do we build policies and checks to ensure that we're following those contracts, and so are the third parties as well.
The only thing I'll add is, you need a combination of these. So don't look at any of these columns as sort of the be all and all shift and shift. I would say use these combinations on an ongoing basis to make sense and figure out what's right for you and your risk. And go back to the privacy KPIs. Look at the KPIs. Are they going up? Are they going down? And look at these controls. So what you want to do is move both at the same time. Like when you have too much risk, you need more controls. When you have stuff moving too slowly, maybe you need to automate more controls. So look at these on an ongoing basis and make those judgment calls rather than just expecting the control to work for you automatically.
Definitely. All right, so we've hit sort of the end of the slideshow today, and we're going to be sharing these slides with everyone after today's session. But we're happy to answer any more questions. Yeah, and we'd happy to go any deeper on uh, Privado's privacy code scanning solutions, uh, web auditor, app auditor solutions that help identify these risks, solutions to help automate. ROPAs, privacy impact assessments. So happy to talk about that as well. Or you can go to our website and learn more about what we have to offer. Okay, if there's no further questions, yeah, we'd like to thank everyone for attending today. And just want to highlight that we have several more webinars coming up. We did a three-part series on website privacy that we got a lot of engagement and interest in. And so we're doing a similar series focused on mobile apps coming up starting at the end of the month. First, focusing on the legal aspect. We have a legal expert coming in, privacy lawyer, Daniel Greenberg. And then we'll have more of your hands-on session with privacy consultants on how they help companies identify and remediate privacy risks in apps and build programs around that. And then also show, how Privado's app auditor product works as well.
Thank you for coming. This was fun. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.